Hey kids, it's time for Bible class. Oh. Hello world, you're watching The Homeschooling Scientist, and you are joining us today for our survey of the New Testament class. Today's lesson, we are going to kind of focus on Jesus towards the end of his life, Last Supper, his trial, all that stuff. And yeah, what do you guys remember from last time? So we talked about the transfiguration. What's the transfiguration?
When Jesus met Elijah and Moses.
Yeah, as part of that, Elijah and Moses appeared. Do you remember what else happened? So the main part of the transfiguration wasn't necessarily that they showed up. What's the transfiguration part of it?
Jesus revealed his glory.
Yeah, when he revealed his glory, and it's like his physical form changed, right? So that's when we talk about the transfiguration. It's kind of like when you think transfiguration, think sort of like transformation, kind of similar, right? Transformation, transfiguration. And yeah, as part of that, also Elijah and Moses appeared, and they all kind of talked together. So yeah.
In my version, it says Elias for Elijah.
Yeah, so Elias and Elijah are like the same person. Sometimes you'll see it as Elijah, sometimes you'll see it as Elias. Yeah, it's a little confusing, potentially, but yep. Nothing sneaky going on. All right, so we talked about a number of other things. How about persecution? What did Jesus say we were supposed to do when persecution comes? Somebody other than Ruby.
Like run away from it.
Yeah, so when persecution comes, we are to flee and, essentially go preach somewhere else. Right? Okay. So this time, like I said, we're going to talk about Last Supper and things like that. Oh, before I get into that, there was one other thing that I wanted to bring up. Because, again, I'm trying to sort of hit on the really important teachings of Jesus without going into everything. But there's one thing I feel like I missed that we really need to touch on. So I'm going to go for this for the discussion. Catherine, would you read John 8:58 for us?
Mm-hmm. Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am.
Okay. So this passage is really important because it sort of shows that Jesus is claiming to be God. And there's other places in the New Testament that make this point, but this is, I think, one of the most clear, most obvious things. Again, this is something that comes up sometimes with people who are not Christians and stuff, is they'll say, well, Jesus was just a good teacher. He never claimed to be God and things like that. But it's just simply not true. This passage kind of highlights that very clearly. So why do you guys think I say that when he says, basically Jesus says, well, before Abraham was, I am. He doesn't say, I'm God, right? So why do I say that this is very clearly him claiming to be God? What do you think?
I think what it was because sometimes he was told himself a way to call me as I am.
Mm-hmm. Very good, yeah.
Also, Abraham was
lived a long time ago,
Yeah.
right?
And
Way before Jesus was born.
yeah.
Yeah, so that's another thing that's kind of interesting when he says, before Abraham was, I am.
A question I have was, how did, if he wasn't God, then how would he know of Abraham? Other than, there's one way I'm thinking of, and that's like he's heard stories of him, but
Well, they had the Old Testament back then,
Yeah.
right? So they knew, all the Jews knew about Abraham because they had the books of Abraham, right? The first 5 books of the New Testament, basically.
Yeah, I think in some other places there's like you did think in one of the previous lessons you said everybody was like, since we are of the generation of Abraham, we're saved. That also proves that they know of Abraham.
Yeah. So anyway, I misspoke there. It wasn't I said the books of Abraham. The books that talk about Abraham is the books of the law of Moses, right? So the first 5 books of the Bible is the law, which was written by Moses, but talks about Abraham, right? So that's basically that's how we know about Abraham is what Moses wrote about him. Okay. So don't want to mix you guys up on that. But yeah, this point of Jesus saying before Abraham was I am, that's like me saying I was alive before America was America, right? And you would hear that and be like, what? No, that's not right. That doesn't make sense. You're not that old. So Jesus is basically claiming to have existed before he was born. So already that's kind of a weird thing to say for somebody, right? But then he uses this phrase, I am. And like Catherine pointed out, that phrase, like, I am, is sort of a big name that God uses, right? Do you remember? Go ahead.
When Moses was going to Pharaoh.
Yeah, that was the example I was going to use. Was when Moses, the whole burning bush thing, and he basically said Moses basically asked God, like, what should I call you? And God says, I am. I am is the one that sent you. So this is a name that God uses for himself. And so when Jesus is saying, before Abraham was, I am, he's basically saying, I am, like, I am the I am, right? I am him. I am God. Right? So this is a big claim. And can you actually go ahead and read the next couple verses, Catherine? So like 59.
then took they up stones to cast at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple.
That's good, actually. And so Jesus says this, and then the Pharisees and all the Jewish leaders and everything pick up stones and they're ready to stone him. Why would they do that?
Because to claim that you are God is just.
Yeah. If for somebody to claim that they're God, that's blasphemy of the highest order, essentially. But in this case, it's not blasphemy because he actually was. But it goes to show that this wasn't Jesus making some random statement, like he just happened to be like, oh yeah, I am, and that he didn't mean to claim that. He said this, he meant to claim that he was the I am, And the Jews that he was talking to knew exactly what he was saying, right? They knew exactly that he was claiming, and their response was pick up stones. They were going to stone him right there for blasphemy, basically, right? So again, just shows crystal clear in this discourse that Jesus has that he claims to be God, and that the people that were there listening to him talk knew exactly what he was saying, that he was claiming to be God. Right? And, their taking up stones to stone him is valid, or would be valid, if he was a normal person. Right? I mean, that's kind of what everything hinges on. If he's just a normal crazy person going around saying they're God, then they're absolutely right. Now, we don't stone people for that in this day and age, but back then that was the punishment for it. But if he is God, then obviously the response here is completely wrong. And then, interestingly enough, I just figure I'd point this out while we're talking about it. It says like Jesus passed through the midst of them. Or how is it phrased again, Catherine? Would you read the last part of verse 59?
This part.
Yeah, that it said going through the midst of them, and he passed by. And I think it's easy to gloss over, but this is really, if you think about it, this is another miracle that Jesus is doing right here.
But did he go invisible?
Maybe. We don't know exactly what happened, but we know that you had a crowd of people. Jesus is sitting there talking. Everybody's looking at him. You've got a crowd of people around him. They get mad at him, they grab their stones and they're ready to kill him. They, charge at him or whatever. And he apparently just walks past them. Like, that's not normal. Again, this has to be some kind of miracle. Either he goes invisible, or he, just supernaturally kind of makes them ignore him, or, I don't know. But this, the point is, this is not a normal thing. If you've got a crowd of people coming at you and they're ready to attack you, you're not going to just walk away from that, right? But that's apparently exactly what he did. They're all coming at him, and he just walks through them like it was nothing. And it's like, well, I don't know how that couldn't be a miracle, right? So anyway, the main point I was making there again is this is very clearly Jesus claiming to be God, and I just wanted, because that's such an important point, I wanted to go back and make sure that we talk about that a bit. All right, so moving on from that, like I said, the main thing I want to talk about today is the Last Supper and sort of the things leading up to Jesus' trial and crucifixion and all of that. So Jesus, this is kind of, towards the end of his life, everything's happening. He's had his ministry, all of his teachings that he's done, all these wonderful conversations that he's had, all this stuff that we can learn from. And now, towards the end of his life, we have Jesus coming back into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And this is what's kind of referred to as like the triumphal entry. Right? This is what we celebrate when we're celebrating Palm Sunday. Right? Because you remember, they put the big palm branches down. It's like a celebration that this is like Jesus is coming as king, ready to rule us. Right? This is the triumphant entry of the king of Jerusalem, the king of the Jews. And that's sort of how they were viewing him at this point. At least a lot of people were. So, and there was a lot of prophecies and everything that surround this too. Um, again, we're not going to go into a lot of details, but just know like this was also kind of an important event. So then we go from that to Jesus eating the Passover meal with his disciples. And this is what we refer to as the Last Supper, right? Because it was kind of the last meal, the last time that Jesus kind of sat down with his disciples and taught them in sort of an extended way. Do you guys remember what the Passover is?
The celebration when the angel passed over the houses in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so back when the angel of death came, it was like the last plague that God sent to Egypt, right? And Pharaoh and the whole "let my people go" thing. So the Passover meal celebrates that or commemorates. I don't know what a better word might be for that, but so they're celebrating the Passover, and Jesus takes this time. Again, there's a number of things that happen. We're not going to get into a lot of them, but he takes the time to sort of set up the New Testament, basically, and talking about the new covenant that's coming, the new covenant that he is going to institute with his blood. And this is where, like when we get communion, it kind of comes from this. So it's sort of a similar idea, right? And it's really interesting timing too, because if you remember, as part of the Passover, they had a sacrifice, and you remember, like the whole part of the Passover was, they put the blood on the sides and top of their door. Some commentators point out they probably did this in a cross shape, which is just sort of an interesting thing to note. But because of the blood of this sacrifice, the angel of death knows this is a house to pass over, right? And so that sacrifice, it's sort of like, death not coming to them because of this sacrifice that's being made. And so it's really interesting that Jesus takes this time to talk about his death and sort of set up the new covenant that's coming with his blood. It's kind of like Jesus saying, like, I am your Passover sacrifice, right? So really interesting timing. And just another thing that kind of fits together. So after they have the Last Supper, Jesus goes and prays in the garden. So first off, if you remember, one of the disciples left the Last Supper early. Who was that?
Judas.
Yeah, why did he leave early?
To tell the Pharisees to capture him.
Yeah, he was the one that kind of sold Jesus out, right? And got money. They paid him money to essentially betray Jesus into their hands. And go ahead.
30 pieces of silver.
Yeah, 30 pieces of silver, that whole thing. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me about that whole thing is because Jesus, at several points during the Last Supper, sort of calls Judas out on this in front of everybody, and they still didn't seem to necessarily pick up on it. Yeah.
I think one of the times he said, like, one of you in here will betray me or something.
Mm-hmm. And what I think is interesting is when he says, one of you will betray me. It's not like everyone just looks over at Judas like, we pretty sure we know who it is, like, as this guy, right? That's not what happened. Like, they were all looking at each other like, who would it be? And I think that it just goes to show none of them really expected Judas. And for someone who was essentially a false disciple, if you will, he sure fit in well with them. And I think, that's a point worth noting because we sort of have the same issues today. And again, this is not something I don't think you guys as kids need to be super aware of. It's not something you need to worry about, but just know, this is something that happens where, people that they come to church, they've been in church for years even, and then you hear about like, oh, they did something horrible or whatever. And it's like, there's definitely people that can sort of like act like they're Christians for even, years. And then only for it to become clear later down the road that they really weren't following Jesus at all. And I think that's kind of really what happened with Judas too. The disciples weren't all like, oh yeah, we know it's this Judas guy that's going to betray Jesus. They were looking around and going, well, is it me? Am I the one that's going to betray him? Is it, they didn't know. So then after that, so Judas left early to betray Jesus. Jesus goes to the garden to pray, Garden of Gethsemane. And then I think, one of the interesting things that happens there is, it talks about how Jesus was like sweating blood. You remember reading that or hearing about that? And that might seem kind of wild. This is actually a thing that does happen to people, can happen to people. That basically people, and if you're sort of predisposed to this kind of thing, but if you're under like super high amounts of stress, it is a thing that can happen. It's like blood vessels and stuff can rupture, and you can essentially like bleed into your sort of like your sweat glands and your skin and things like that. And you can sweat blood.
Yikes.
Yeah. So this wasn't like wasn't necessarily a miracle, but it is a physical reaction that humans have to extreme, and I mean extreme stress, right? And
it shows he is human, so.
Yeah, it shows he's human. And when you look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's praying, right? Jesus knows they're about to come get him, and he's going to have his, sham trial, and he's going to die, he's going to be crucified, and all of that stuff. That he's about to do his main mission of dying for people's sins. And I think it's fair to say he's terrified. He's scared. He's so stressed that he's sweating blood. And do you remember what he said? He's praying when he's there. He says, Father, if it's at all possible, let this cup pass from me. Right? He's praying and he basically says to God, I don't want to do this. If there's any other way, I don't want to do this. If it's at all possible for people to be saved in any other way, let's do it that other way, right? But I'm here to do your will, is, basically what he says, right? Why is Jesus so scared? Think about this. Jesus, we say it, as we said, he's a human, yes, but he's also God. He's God in human form. He could, everybody that's coming to get him, all the soldiers, he could snap his fingers and take them all out if he wanted to. Why is he scared? Do you think he's scared of dying? there's lots of people, lots of Christians that have died over, 2,000 years, let's call it, since Jesus came. And many of them have accepted their fate with joy, even, and, died in horrible ways, singing songs, even. Is Jesus less brave than they were? So why is he so scared?
I think in when he dies, it says like, doesn't it say that God looked away from him?
Mm-hmm. The Father turned his back on him. Yeah. Which might seem like a small thing, but you have to think that this is Jesus we're talking about, that, he said, as he puts it, I and my Father are one. So before God even created the world, there was God the Father and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and we talk about the Trinity, right? Like one God in three parts, but these in perfect harmony with each other. And Jesus, even after he became a human, always did the will of God. Always, every time you had God talk about him, it was, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased, right? In the history of the universe, the Father had never turned his back on the Son or done anything that there was no separation between them, right? Since before the universe was even created. And this is what Jesus was facing, right? Because you remember how we talk about Jesus took the punishment for our sins? So it wasn't just the Father turning his back on him, right? It's all the punishment that we deserve for our sin. It's God putting that on Jesus instead of us, right? So it's not just, I think if it was just a normal death, Jesus could have faced that no problem. I think what he was scared of was, he was scared of being separated from God the Father. He was scared of having all the punishment that we deserve put on him, right? Think about that. The whole world, every human that's ever lived, and the punishment, the debt that we have earned, every human in the world that's ever lived, every sin that's ever been committed, right? All of that being put on Jesus on the cross. And it actually describes it, in the Bible, it actually describes it as this, that he became sin for us, right? Jesus became sin for us that we might be made the righteousness of God through him, and so on and so forth. So that's another thing to think about. This is Jesus, who is God, who is holy, right? Holier than anything we can imagine. He's never desired sin. He's been tempted, sure, in the sense that he's been like tested, but he's never sinned. He's never wanted to sin or anything like that. It's like perfect, this person who was perfectly holy, and now they have to become the sin of the world, have all the universe, all the sin in the universe put on them, and God punish him for it instead of us, right? So I think this is worth pointing out because I think this is why, when you see Jesus sweating blood and saying, I don't want to do this, basically, right? Saying, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. That's, I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what he's saying. He's saying, I don't want to do this. If there's any other way that people can be saved, I want to do that instead. But that's the whole point, is like, there was no other way, right? This is the only way that God can be just, as the Bible puts it, that God can be just and the justifier of us, of sinners, right? People that do bad things. If God is just, he has to punish evil, he has to punish sin. And so that means he has to punish us. The only way that could, that we can be saved then, is if Jesus takes that punishment for us. Because God, God can't just look at us and say, well, I'll forgive you, I'm not going to punish your sin, because that's not justice, right? This is, and we'll get into this later, but the book of Romans really lays this out. Goes into a lot of some depth of this, and talking about how is it that God can be both merciful and just. And that's, if you think about it like that, it's hard to imagine, really the only way God can be both merciful and just is through Jesus, right? All right. I think we'll call it good there, because that just seems like a really good note to end on. And yeah, next time we'll get into like the crucifixion and the trial and all that. But yeah, I think this is, to me, this is one of the most important things to think about in, the whole story of the crucifixion and everything, is to realize that when Jesus was dying on the cross, it wasn't just about, the torture of dying on a cross. And let's be real, crucifixion was a very brutal form of torture, of killing somebody. It was a very slow and painful way to die. But there's been, the Romans were experts at crucifying people, right? So it's not like humans haven't faced this before.
Did you know that Jesus died faster and they were very surprised by
Yeah,
it?
yeah, he did. But, we'll get into maybe some of that next time. So, anyway, any other thoughts, questions? Nope. All right. On that somber note, then, we'll see you next time. Oh, wait.
What's somber mean?
Somber, like solemn, like serious. Okay. And we'll see you next time. For real this time.
Bye!
Peace out.